She vanished without a trace, leaving her family searching for answers that would elude them for 2 decades. Her disappearance became a cold case, a painful memory that faded from headlines, but never from the hearts of those who loved her. Then, in an unbelievable twist of fate that defies all odds, a television camera scanning an audience revealed what thousands of police hours could not. She was alive. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Robert McAllister nearly dropped his glass of water, the ice cubes clinking against the sides as his trembling hand struggled to maintain its grip. He fumbled for the remote control, pressing the rewind button with such force that his arthritic finger ached. The game show footage played again before his widened eyes, and he leaned forward in his worn recliner, his heart pounding against his ribs. "It can't be," he whispered to the empty room, but with each replay, the certainty grew within him. That face, older now with darker hair but unmistakable, the distinctive dimple in her cheek when she smiled, the arch of her eyebrows that he'd recognize anywhere. His niece, Claire Donnelly, missing for 20 years, was sitting in a game show audience in Los Angeles. The retired mail carrier paused the recording on her face, his finger hovering over the screen as if he could reach through it and touch her. Hope surged through him, a sensation so foreign after 2 decades of grief that it almost hurt. He'd buried that hope years ago, had learned to live with the dull ache of uncertainty that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. With shaking hands, Robert reached for his phone and dialed his sister's number. "Margaret," he said, his voice cracking, "you need to come over, now." When Margaret Donnelly arrived 30 minutes later, her brother's unusual urgency had already set her nerves on edge. The homemaker had aged considerably since her daughter's disappearance, grief etching deep lines around her eyes and mouth. "What is it, Robert?" she asked, removing her coat. He guided her to the couch, positioning her directly in front of the television. "Just watch," he said softly, pressing play. As the footage rolled, Margaret's body went rigid. Her hands flew to her mouth, trembling violently as the camera panned across the studio audience, lingering for just seconds on a face they both knew intimately. "It's her," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She reached out toward the screen, just as her brother had done. "My God, Robert, it's really her." The years of uncertainty came rushing back like a flood. The searches along the riverbank, the faded missing person posters, the false lead at the Virginia rest stop, the endless nights of wondering. All those years of not knowing if Claire was alive or dead, if she was suffering or at peace. What happened to her? Margaret's voice broke as she asked the question that had haunted her, their family for 20 years. "Where has she been all this time?" Robert placed his hand on his sister's shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility he'd carried since the day his niece vanished. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but we're going to find out." Robert nearly drops his glass, the ice cubes clinking against the sides as his hand trembles. He fumbles for the remote, rewinding the recording again and again. Each viewing only strengthens his certainty. That dimple when she smiled, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, mannerisms etched into his memory from 20 years of searching. "It can't be," he whispers, but his heart races with a hope he had long ago buried. The retired mail carrier sits forward in his recliner, scrutinizing every pixel of the paused image. After years of false leads and disappointments, could this finally be real? With shaking fingers, Robert McAllister dials his sister's number. Margaret Donnelly answers on the 3rd ring, her voice tired from carrying 2 decades of grief. "Maggie, I need you to see something," he says, trying to keep his voice steady. "Right now." Within the hour, Margaret is seated beside her brother, clutching a framed photograph of Claire, taken just weeks before she vanished. As Robert plays the recording, Margaret's breathing grows shallow. The camera pans across the studio audience, lingering for just seconds on a dark-haired woman with a familiar smile. "Stop it there," she whispers, her voice barely audible. Margaret's hands tremble as she holds the photograph beside the television screen. The woman on TV is older, her features matured by 20 years, but the resemblance is undeniable. The same arch of eyebrows, the same dimple in her right cheek when she smiles. "It's her," Margaret says, tears streaming down her face. "Robert, it's my baby." The siblings sit in stunned silence, the weight of possibility crushing the air from the room. For 20 years they'd lived in the purgatory of not knowing. Was Claire dead? Kidnapped? Had she chosen to leave? The uncertainty had slowly poisoned their family. Daniel had withdrawn into himself, rarely speaking of their daughter anymore. Margaret had kept Claire's room exactly as she'd left it, a shrine to frozen time. "We need to find out where this was filmed," Robert says finally, determination hardening his voice. "When it aired, who was in that audience?" Margaret nods, clutching the photograph to her chest. The years of uncertainty come rushing back. The initial panic, the frantic searches, the gradual fading of hope. But now, that terrible question returns with renewed urgency. What happened to Claire? And if she's alive, why has she stayed away all these years? "I need to call Daniel," Margaret whispers, reaching for her phone. Robert places his hand over hers. "Let's be sure first. We can't put him through another false hope." Detective James Harmon arrived at the Donnelly residence just after 9 in the morning. The family home, normally a sanctuary of warmth, had transformed overnight into a site of investigation. Margaret Donnelly paced anxiously while Daniel sat motionless at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched and cold. "We need to understand Claire's routines, her friendships, any changes in behavior," Detective Harmon explained, his voice gentle but firm. The veteran officer had handled dozens of missing persons cases, but the first 48 hours were always critical. Officers fanned out across town, interviewing Claire's circle of friends. Most expressed shock, describing her as adventurous but reliable. "She would never just vanish," insisted her closest friend, Melissa. "Something happened to her." Another friend mentioned Claire's fascination with urban photography, how she would sometimes venture into abandoned buildings for the perfect shot. Back at the station, investigators created a timeline. Claire had last been seen leaving home at 7:30 in the evening, camera bag slung over her shoulder. She had told Margaret she was meeting friends downtown, but none reported seeing her that night. Her cell phone remained unanswered, its last signal picked up near the old railroad bridge, before going silent. Robert McAllister arrived to support his sister, bringing coffee and sandwiches no one would eat. "She's a smart girl," he reassured Margaret, though his eyes betrayed his growing concern. When detectives received permission to search Claire's room, they discovered a treasure trove of journals. The 19-year-old had documented her thoughts meticulously, filling pages with observations, poetry, and dreams of artistic recognition. Margaret hovered in the doorway as officers carefully cataloged each notebook. It was Daniel who noticed the discrepancy first. "This one has a page torn out," he said, holding up a spiral-bound journal. The detectives examined it closely. The missing page had been carefully removed, leaving only tiny paper fragments in the binding. The entries before and after revealed nothing obvious, but the deliberate removal suggested Claire had written something she didn't want others to see. "Could be nothing," Detective Harmon said, but his expression hardened. "Or it could be everything." The investigation intensified. Officers reviewed security footage from businesses near the bridge. They checked hospital admissions and bus terminals. They interviewed Claire's photography instructor, who mentioned her recent interest in night scenes and urban landscapes. As the second day of Claire's absence dawned, the weight of uncertainty settled over the Donnelly home. Margaret clutched her daughter's childhood teddy bear, while Daniel retreated further into silence. Robert tried to keep them both grounded, making calls and coordinating with neighbors who wanted to help. The missing page from Claire's journal haunted them all. A blank space where answers should be, a void as empty as the chair at their dinner table. The morning after Claire Donnelly's disappearance, the small Pennsylvania town mobilized with remarkable speed. Volunteers gathered at the local church, clutching thermoses of coffee and wearing sturdy boots. Margaret and Daniel Donnelly stood shell-shocked as Robert McAllister organized search parties, his postal carrier's knowledge of the area proving invaluable. "My niece was last seen heading toward Blackwater River," Robert explained, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We'll divide into teams of 4 and cover every inch of the shoreline." The community responded with quiet determination. Teachers from Claire's old high school, neighbors who had watched her grow up, even strangers touched by the family's anguish, all fanned out along the riverbank. They combed through underbrush and called Claire's name until their voices grew hoarse. Margaret walked alongside Daniel, their marriage already showing the first fractures of grief. She clutched her daughter's photograph, showing it to every passerby. "Have you seen her? Please, she has a dimple when she smiles." By nightfall, the search had yielded nothing. No footprints in the soft mud, no sign of Claire's beloved camera, not even a thread from her clothing caught on a branch, just emptiness that seemed to mock their efforts. The next day brought more volunteers, and the next after that. Police officers joined with tracking dogs that sniffed Claire's pillowcase before leading their handlers through thickets and over rocky outcroppings. The animals whined in confusion, unable to pick up any scent trail. "It's like she vanished into thin air," one officer told Robert quietly, away from Margaret's hearing. No evidence of foul play, but no evidence of anything. As days stretched into weeks, the search parties grew smaller. The police investigation continued, but without physical evidence. Detectives could only compile interview notes and theories. They questioned Claire's friends repeatedly, searching for inconsistencies or hidden knowledge. Daniel withdrew further into himself with each passing day. At night, Margaret found him sitting in Claire's room, staring at the photographs their daughter had taken. Stark, black and white images of abandoned buildings and empty streets that now seemed prophetic. "She was always looking for something," Daniel whispered once, the most he'd spoken in days. What if she found it? Robert remained the family's anchor, dividing his time between comforting his sister and pressing the authorities for action. But even his determination couldn't manufacture evidence where none existed. The physical trail had vanished as completely as Claire herself, leaving the Donnelly family suspended in a terrible limbo, too afraid to hope, too stubborn to despair. In the absence of answers, speculation and dread took root, growing stronger with each sunset that brought no word of the missing young woman. The flyers, bearing Claire Donnelly's face, began to yellow and curl at the edges. Rain blurred her smile, and sunlight faded her eyes until she became a ghost on the lamp-posts of rural Pennsylvania. 3 months after her disappearance, the police calls became less frequent. The search parties disbanded, and the community's urgent concern gradually transformed into sympathetic glances at the grocery store. Margaret refused to hold a memorial service despite gentle suggestions from friends and their pastor. "My daughter isn't dead," she would say with quiet certainty, smoothing her hands over her apron. "We don't mourn the living." Daniel would stand silently beside her during these conversations, his weathered face revealing nothing of the storm within. Every evening, Margaret would enter Claire's bedroom, dust the untouched surfaces, and straighten the already perfect bedspread. The room remained frozen in time, photography magazines stacked neatly on the desk, her favorite sweater draped over the chair, waiting for her return. Margaret would sometimes sit on the edge of the bed, holding Claire's pillow to her chest, breathing in what remained of her daughter's scent. Robert McAllister established his own ritual. Each Sunday after church he would drive the 30 minutes to his sister's home, bringing fresh flowers for the kitchen table and news of any potential leads, however insignificant. "I spoke with that state trooper again," he might say. "They're still checking cameras at bus stations in 3 states. Or, that girl they found in Ohio wasn't her. We knew it wouldn't be." The siblings would sit together at the kitchen table while Daniel retreated to the garage, losing himself in mindless repair projects. The rhythmic sound of his hammer would punctuate their conversations about Claire. "She loved those autumn colors," Margaret once whispered, watching leaves scatter across the yard through the window. "Remember how she'd spend hours with that camera of hers, just photographing the same tree as the light changed?" The ache of uncertainty settled into their bones like arthritis, a persistent pain they learned to function around. The Donnelly home became a museum of absence, each room defined by what was missing rather than what remained. At night, Margaret would leave the porch light on, a beacon for a lost daughter. Robert would scan crowds in shopping malls and restaurants, his heart leaping at every young woman with a similar walk or laugh. And Daniel, in his silent grief, would check the mailbox twice daily, hoping for a letter, a postcard, any sign that Claire was alive somewhere in the world. The rituals of waiting replaced the rituals of normal life, and as winter approached, the family clung to hope with the desperate strength of those who have nothing else left to hold. As months passed, the flyers featuring Claire Donnelly's face began to fade on lamp-posts throughout the community. The vibrant colors that once demanded attention now peeled at the corners, weathered by rain and sun, much like the hope that had initially fueled the search efforts. The Donnellys refused to hold a memorial service, a decision that raised eyebrows among neighbors but made perfect sense to those who understood the crushing weight of uncertainty. "We can't say goodbye to someone who might still be out there," Margaret would say firmly whenever well-meaning friends suggested it might bring closure. Her voice never wavered on this point, though her eyes told a different story. The ache of not knowing settled into their lives like an unwelcome houseguest who refused to leave. Margaret kept Claire's bedroom exactly as she had left it. Camera manuals stacked on the desk, clothes still hanging in the closet, even the half-empty glass of water on the nightstand. She dusted weekly, changing nothing, preserving the space as if her daughter might walk through the door any moment. Robert McAllister visited his sister's home every Sunday without fail, He would sit with Margaret at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and sharing neighborhood news, carefully avoiding the elephant in the room until one of them inevitably circled back to Claire. Sometimes he brought newspaper clippings about similar cases where the missing person had returned home years later. "They found that girl from Minnesota after 4 years," he might say, sliding the article across the table. "She'd been living in Seattle the whole time." Daniel Donnelly coped differently. The once talkative man grew increasingly silent, retreating into his workshop for hours. When he emerged, sawdust clinging to his clothes, he would nod at Robert but rarely engage in the hopeful conversations his wife and brother-in-law shared. The family's routines became rituals of waiting. Margaret answered every phone call on the first ring. Robert scanned every crowd instinctively. Daniel checked the mailbox twice daily. Their lives continued in this suspended animation, unable to move forward, unwilling to accept an ending. On Claire's birthday, Margaret baked her favorite chocolate cake. On Christmas, they hung her stocking. Small acts of faith that felt both necessary and painful. "Sometimes I think I see her," Margaret confessed to Robert one Sunday afternoon. "In the grocery store, at the mall. Just glimpses. Then I blink, and it's someone else entirely." Robert squeezed her hand. "I know," he said simply because he did. The phantom sightings were part of their shared experience now. Brief moments when the heart raced with possibility before reality crashed back in. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The crushing weight of disappointment descended upon the Donnelly household like a physical presence. Margaret Donnelly sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, the Virginia rest stop footage replaying in her mind. The woman who had given them such hope, who, for a fleeting moment they believed was Claire, was just another stranger with a passing resemblance to her daughter. "They didn't try hard enough," Margaret whispered, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched coffee cup. Her faith in law enforcement, once unwavering, had begun to crack. If they'd gotten there sooner, if they'd checked more cameras. In the living room, Daniel retreated further into himself. The father who once filled their home with laughter now barely spoke, his silence more deafening than any argument. He spent hours staring at old photographs, his expression unreadable, shoulders hunched with the burden of 3 years without answers. Robert McAllister watched his family splinter before his eyes. The retired mail carrier had always been the family's backbone, but even his strength was being tested. He drove the 40 minutes from his home every day now, bringing groceries, checking the mail, making sure his sister ate something. "You can't give up," he told Margaret one evening, his hand covering hers. "Claire wouldn't want us falling apart like this." But the words rang hollow, even to him. The false lead had reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Each family member retreated to private islands of grief, connected only by the thin threads of shared loss. At Sunday dinner, a tradition Robert insisted they maintain, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Daniel pushed food around his plate. Margaret asked about the weather, her voice brittle. When Robert mentioned a new detective assigned to cold cases, Daniel abruptly stood and left the table. "Let him go," Margaret said when Robert moved to follow. "He blames himself. Always has." Later that night, Robert found a stack of unpaid bills in the kitchen drawer. He settled them quietly, not mentioning it to his sister. The practical matters of life continued, even as their emotional lives hung suspended in uncertainty. The Donnelly home, once warm and inviting, now felt like a museum of absence. Claire's bedroom remained untouched, a time capsule of the 19-year-old who vanished in 1999. Margaret dusted it weekly, speaking softly to the empty room as if her daughter might answer. Trust within the family frayed further with each passing day. Unspoken blame circulated between them. Daniel's late work nights when Claire was a teenager, Margaret's overprotectiveness that might have pushed her away, Robert's assurances that everything would be fine. None of them said these thoughts aloud. None of them needed to. The accusations hung in the air, mingling with exhaustion and the terrible weight of not knowing. The false lead from Virginia devastated the Donnelly family. Margaret Donnelly sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of tea that had long gone cold, her shoulders slumped with the weight of yet another shattered hope. The security footage that had promised so much delivered only another cruel disappointment. "I really thought it was her this time," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert McAllister placed a comforting hand on his sister's shoulder, though he too felt hollowed out by the experience. The investigation had consumed their lives for nearly 3 years. Each promising lead had ended the same way, with nothing. The police officers who had once filled their home with activity now rarely called, and when they did, their voices carried the unmistakable tone of obligation rather than expectation. Daniel Donnelly retreated further into himself after the Virginia incident. The once talkative father now spent most evenings in his workshop, the rhythmic sound of his sanding becoming the household's melancholy soundtrack. He avoided discussions about Claire, changing the subject whenever her name arose. "He's given up," Margaret confided to her brother one Sunday afternoon as they watched Daniel working in the yard. "He doesn't even look at her photographs anymore." Robert tried to mediate between the couple, but the strain had created fault lines in their marriage that widened with each passing month. During family dinners, silence stretched between them like an uninvited guest. Trust began to erode in subtle ways. Margaret questioned why Daniel hadn't pushed harder with the investigators. Daniel wondered aloud why Margaret had let Claire go out that night without asking more questions. Robert found himself caught between them, trying to preserve what remained of their family bond. "We need to stay united," the retired mail carrier reminded them repeatedly. "For Claire's sake." But unity proved elusive. Margaret threw herself into awareness campaigns, plastering fresh missing person posters throughout 3 counties every month. Daniel withdrew into 12-hour workdays. Robert tried to bridge the gap, visiting every Sunday with news clippings about similar cases where people had been found alive years later. The Donnelly home, once filled with laughter and conversation, became a museum of grief. Claire's bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to absence. Holidays passed with forced smiles and careful avoidance of the empty chair. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where accusations had been thinly veiled as concern, Robert found Margaret alone on the porch swing. "I don't know how much longer we can go on like this," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "Sometimes I think not knowing is worse than any truth could be." Robert had no answer, only the steadfast presence that had become his role in this unending tragedy. The family continued to drift apart, each member isolated by their private relationship with hope and despair. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The weight of Claire Donnelly's absence pressed down on the family like an invisible burden, growing heavier with each passing year. By 2006, Margaret Donnelly's once vibrant spirit had dimmed considerably. Her health began to deteriorate. Sleepless nights and constant worry etched deep lines around her eyes and robbed her of her former vitality. Robert McAllister stepped in as her primary caretaker, driving 40 minutes each way to check on his sister several times a week, bringing groceries and making sure she took her medication. "You need to eat something," Robert would insist, watching Margaret push food around her plate without interest. Daniel Donnelly, meanwhile, retreated further into himself. The once talkative father now spent most evenings in his workshop, crafting wooden furniture that nobody needed, the rhythmic sound of sandpaper against wood the only therapy he allowed himself. He rarely mentioned their daughter anymore, as if speaking her name might conjure more pain than he could bear. On the 10th anniversary of Claire's disappearance, the family gathered at the Donnelly home in rural Pennsylvania. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken grief. Robert had convinced his sister to prepare a small dinner, hoping familiar routines might ease the tension. "I found more of Claire's photography negatives," Margaret announced, her voice wavering as she placed a small box on the dining table. "I thought we could look through them together." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What's the point, Maggie? It's been 10 years. The point?" Margaret's voice rose sharply. "Our daughter is out there somewhere." "You don't know that," Daniel muttered, pushing away from the table. "And you've given up," she accused, tears streaming down her face. "You don't even say her name anymore. It's like you want to forget she ever existed." The room fell silent. Robert reached for his sister's hand, but she pulled away. Daniel stood motionless, his back to them both. When he finally turned, his expression was one of raw anguish. "I got an email," he confessed, his voice barely audible. 3 years ago. Anonymous, just 7 words. "She doesn't want to be found." Nothing else. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You kept this from me?" "All this time?" "I couldn't tell you," Daniel replied, his shoulders slumping. "It would have destroyed you, and I couldn't be sure it was real." "How could you decide that for me?" Margaret whispered, betrayal evident in every syllable. Robert watched helplessly as the fragile threads holding his family together began to unravel. The revelation hung in the air between them, a new wound atop the old. Was Claire truly alive somewhere, deliberately staying hidden? Or was someone playing a cruel game with a broken family's hope? The weight of the years pressed down on the Donnelly family like a physical presence. Margaret's health had begun to deteriorate, her once vibrant demeanor now dulled by persistent uncertainty. Robert McAllister stepped into the role of caretaker for his sister, visiting her home 3 times a week with groceries and companionship. Daniel Donnelly had withdrawn further into himself, rarely mentioning his daughter's name anymore. On the 20th anniversary of Claire's disappearance, Robert organized a small family gathering, hoping to bring some semblance of unity back to their fractured lives. The atmosphere in the living room was suffocating with unspoken grief. Photo albums remained closed on the coffee table, too painful to open. "I made her favorite casserole," Margaret said, her voice thin as she set the dish on the dining table. "Just in case." Daniel stared at the empty chair where Claire used to sit. "It's been 20 years, he muttered. "And we'll wait 20 more if that's what it takes," Margaret snapped, her hands trembling. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly erupted. "You've given up," she accused her husband. "You've buried her in your mind, while I still feel her alive in my heart." Daniel's face contorted with a pain Robert had never seen before. "You think I don't suffer every day?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "You think I don't see her face every time I close my eyes?" Then, in a moment of raw honesty that silenced the room, Daniel revealed what he'd been carrying alone for years. "I got an email," he confessed, 3 years after she vanished. Anonymous. It just said, "She doesn't want to be found." Margaret collapsed into her chair. "You kept this from me? All these years?" "I couldn't tell you," Daniel whispered. "It would have destroyed you." Robert moved between them, trying desperately to hold the pieces together. "We don't know who sent that message," he reasoned. "It could have been anyone playing a cruel joke. But the damage was done. The revelation fractured the family further, opening questions none of them were prepared to face. If Claire was alive, had she chosen to stay away? Was she in danger, or had she simply abandoned them? Or was someone manipulating their grief for some unfathomable reason? Margaret retreated to Claire's untouched bedroom that night, clutching her daughter's old sweater. Daniel slept on the couch. Robert stayed up until dawn, looking through old case files, searching for anything they might have missed. The grief that had united them for so long was now compounded by doubt, turning their shared pain into individual torment. The possibility that Claire might have chosen absence was, in some ways, more devastating than the uncertainty they'd lived with for 2 decades. The revelation fractured the Donnelly family further. Margaret was devastated by Daniel's secrecy, her hands trembling as she confronted him about the email. 20 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible. 20 years I've been waiting, hoping, praying, and you kept this from me? Daniel Donnelly stood by the window, shoulders hunched, the weight of his confession visible in every line of his body. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, not meeting her eyes. "What if it was true? What if she really didn't want us to find her?" Robert McAllister watched his sister and brother-in-law from across the room, feeling the familiar ache of helplessness. He had always been the mediator, the one who held the fragments of their family together when grief threatened to scatter them beyond recovery. Now, that role seemed impossible. "You had no right," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "No right to decide what I should know about my own daughter." The house fell silent except for Margaret's quiet sobs. Robert moved to comfort his sister, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We don't know who sent that email," he reminded them both. "It could have been anyone, a cruel prank, or someone who thought they were helping." The question hung in the air, impossible to answer. Was Claire alive all this time, deliberately staying away? The possibility was both hopeful and devastating. If she was alive, why wouldn't she come home? What could have happened to make her cut all ties? Or was someone playing a cruel trick on a grieving father? Daniel had carried this burden alone for years, afraid of what the truth might do to his wife. Now that fear had become reality. The family was splintering before their eyes. That night, Robert stayed at the Donnelly home, sleeping on the couch as he had done so many times during the worst days after Claire disappeared. He could hear Margaret moving around upstairs, opening and closing drawers, unable to rest. Daniel had retreated to the garage, where he often went when emotions became too raw. Robert stared at the ceiling, thinking about his niece. The Claire he remembered was headstrong and independent, but also deeply loving. The idea that she would willingly cause such pain seemed impossible to reconcile with the young woman who had once sneaked extra cookies to neighborhood children and spent hours helping her uncle organize his stamp collection. Doubt crept in like a fog. What if the email was real? What if Claire had chosen this separation? The thought was almost more painful than believing she had met with harm. At least tragedy had no intent. This would be a deliberate breaking of bonds. Morning would come, and they would face each other again, a family bound by love and fractured by uncertainty. The truth about Claire seemed further away than ever. In 2015, the case that had gone cold for years suddenly found new life in the most unexpected of places: the Internet. Amateur detectives, drawn to unsolved mysteries like moths to flame, began connecting Claire Donnelly's disappearance to other young women who had vanished in the late 90s. On one particularly active forum, a user with the handle Cold Case Hunter posted something that sent shockwaves through the online community. They had discovered photographs from an art exhibition in Portland, casually browsing through a local gallery's archive. In the background of one image, partially obscured but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, stood a woman bearing a striking resemblance to Claire. The gallery confirmed that the artist had submitted work under an alias, Nightlight Photography, with no real name attached to the submission. Payment had been arranged through an anonymous money order. What caught Margaret's attention most was one particular canvas. It featured the exact same skyline photograph she had received years earlier, the one she had kept framed beside her bed all this time. "It has to be her," Margaret whispered, tracing her finger over the printed image Robert had brought her. Her hands trembled with a mixture of hope and fear. "She's telling us she's alive." The Portland Police Department reluctantly reopened the file, but the trail quickly went cold. The alias led nowhere. No social media presence, no digital footprint, not even a phone number. The gallery owner remembered only that the artist's representative had been polite but private, insisting on anonymity as part of the artistic experience. Despite the frustrating dead ends, Margaret clung to this new evidence like a lifeline. She began collecting art show catalogs from across the country, searching for that distinctive photographic style. She would spend hours poring over images, convinced that her daughter was communicating through her art. "She always loved photography," she reminded Daniel, who remained skeptical, wounded by years of false hopes. "This is how she's reaching out." Robert took a more practical approach. He quietly contacted art galleries throughout Portland, showing Claire's photograph to employees, hoping someone might recognize her. He visited camera shops, wondering if she might have maintained her passion for photography. Each inquiry led nowhere, yet he persisted. "Even if it's not her," he told Margaret during one of their Sunday visits, "it means someone remembers her. Someone cares enough to leave these breadcrumbs." The family remained divided on what these new discoveries meant. For Margaret, they were proof of life. For Daniel, they were cruel reminders of loss. For Robert, they were simply questions that demanded answers, regardless of how painful those answers might be. August 12, 2019, marked exactly 20 years since Claire Donnelly vanished. The date that had become a somber anniversary in the Donnelly household suddenly transformed into something else entirely. Robert McAllister's chance sighting on the television game show had shattered 2 decades of silence. "Play it again," Margaret Donnelly whispered, her fingers trembling as she clutched her brother's arm. Robert nodded, rewinding the recording for what felt like the 100th time. They huddled together in Margaret's living room, the same space where they had reviewed missing persons reports and police statements years before. Frame by frame, they analyzed the footage. The camera had panned across the audience for barely 3 seconds, but it was enough. There she was, older, with darker hair, but unmistakably Claire. The dimple when she smiled, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. These were mannerisms etched into Margaret's memory. "I need to be certain," Robert said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions. The retired mail carrier had always been the family's anchor, especially as Daniel withdrew further into himself over the years. Now he was methodical, taking screenshots and enlarging images on his tablet. Margaret alternated between tearful hope and paralyzing fear. "What if it's not her? What if we're seeing what we want to see?" she asked, voicing the doubt that had followed every potential lead for 20 years. They contacted the production company the next morning. The woman on the phone was sympathetic but cautious. "We maintain audience records for 6 months, she explained. "I can check the taping from May." 3 agonizing days later, they received the information. The show had been filmed in Los Angeles. Audience tickets required minimal identification, just a name and email address for confirmation. The seat chart showed something unexpected. Where Claire had been sitting, the name listed was Elise Carson. Elise Carson, Margaret repeated, testing the unfamiliar name on her tongue. Who is Elise Carson? Robert immediately began searching online but found nothing conclusive. No social media profiles matched both the name and what they could see of the woman's appearance. The journalist who had covered Claire's disappearance years ago couldn't find any public records for an Elise Carson matching their description in Los Angeles. If it's Claire, Robert said carefully, she might be using an alias. The thought hung heavy between them. If Claire was alive and using another name, what did that mean? Had she been hiding all this time? Was she in danger? Or had she chosen to disappear? Margaret stared at the frozen image on the screen, at the face of the woman who might be her daughter. "We need to go to Los Angeles," she said, her voice suddenly firm. "I need to know if my daughter is alive." August 1917 marked a pivotal moment for the Donnelly family. Robert McAllister's hands trembled as he rewound the recording for the 20th time. The image on the screen remained unchanged. His niece Claire, missing for 20 years, sitting in a game show audience. "Elise Carson," Margaret Donnelly whispered, staring at the name they'd received from the show's producers. "Who is Elise Carson?" Her voice cracked with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The unfamiliar name felt like both a barrier and a bridge to her daughter. Robert placed his arm around his sister's shoulders. "We need to go to Los Angeles," he said firmly. "We've waited too long already." The retired mail carrier had spent decades delivering other people's messages. Now he needed to deliver his family to the truth. Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving the frozen image on the screen. After years of false leads and disappointments, this felt different. The woman's dimpled smile was unmistakable, the same smile that had been frozen in time on the missing person flyers that once papered their small Pennsylvania town. "I'll make the arrangements," Robert said, already mentally preparing for the journey. He knew his sister's health had declined over the years of waiting, but he saw a new energy in her movements as she began packing that evening. The following morning, Robert reached out to James Harmon, the journalist who had first covered Claire's disappearance in 1999. Though Harmon had moved on to national stories, he had kept in touch with the family, checking in on anniversaries of Claire's disappearance. "I can be there tomorrow," Harmon told them over the phone. "I still have contacts in Los Angeles who can help us track her down discreetly." The journalist's voice carried the weight of 20 years following cold cases, but also the rare excitement of possibly solving one. 3 days later, they gathered in a hotel room in downtown Los Angeles. Maps and printouts covered the bed as Harmon explained his strategy. "The studio requires minimal identification for audience members, but they do keep records of contact information. My source says Elise Carson listed an address in Echo Park." Margaret clutched a photograph of Claire, the last one taken before she vanished. "What if it's not her?" she asked, voicing the fear they all shared. "Then we keep searching," Robert replied, his determination unwavering. "But it's her." "I know it's her." Harmon nodded, spreading out several screenshots from the game show footage. "I've been analyzing these frames. Notice how she turns away when the camera pans toward her section? That's not coincidence. That's someone who doesn't want to be found." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The new name was a puzzle piece that changed everything. Robert McAllister and his sister Margaret Donnelly decided they couldn't pursue this lead from Pennsylvania. They needed to go to Los Angeles themselves. The journey felt both desperate and hopeful, a pilgrimage 20 years in the making. "I need to see her with my own eyes," Margaret whispered as they booked their flights. Her hands trembled slightly, the weight of 2 decades of uncertainty visible in every movement. Robert reached out to the journalist who had first covered Claire's disappearance back in 1999. The man remembered the case immediately. The young photographer who vanished without a trace had stayed with him through the years. He agreed to help, leveraging his media connections to quietly track down the woman spotted in the audience. In a hotel room overlooking the sprawling Los Angeles cityscape, they created a makeshift investigation center. The journalist brought enhanced copies of the footage, and together they scrutinized every frame, searching for details that might confirm their suspicions. "Stop there," Robert said during their third viewing. His finger pointed to something they'd missed before. Look at her left hand. Margaret leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Is that the ring I gave her for her 16th birthday? Robert confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. But as they continued analyzing the footage, something else emerged, something that complicated their search. Claire was not alone. Beside her sat a man, perhaps in his 40s, leaning in protectively. As the camera panned across the audience, he whispered something in her ear, his hand resting possessively on her arm. Who is he? Margaret asked, her hope now mingled with apprehension. The journalist captured still images of the man's face. This adds another dimension to your search, he explained carefully. We need to understand his relationship to her. The questions multiplied. Was this man somehow connected to Claire's disappearance? Had he been controlling her all these years? Or was he simply a partner, unaware of her past? The protective posture could be read multiple ways. As possessive, as caring, as cautious. If she's been living as Elise Carson all this time, Robert reasoned, then this man must know something about her true identity. Margaret stared at the frozen image of the man's face, trying to read the story behind his eyes. What if he's the reason she never came home? The mystery only deepened as they continued their investigation, the man's presence adding layers of complexity to Claire's story. What had once seemed a simple case of finding a missing person now felt like unraveling a life deliberately hidden, with someone else potentially guarding its secrets. After weeks of painstaking detective work, Robert McAllister and his sister Margaret Donnelly finally had their breakthrough. Working with the journalist who had covered Claire's disappearance 2 decades earlier, they traced the name Elise Carson to a community center in East Los Angeles. This has to be her, Margaret whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched a printed staff directory showing a blurry photo of a woman with dark hair. The resemblance was unmistakable despite the years that had passed. Robert placed a steadying hand on his sister's shoulder. We need to be prepared for anything, he cautioned, though his heart raced with anticipation. The siblings had rehearsed this moment countless times during their journey to California, but now that it was imminent, words seemed inadequate. They arrived at the community center on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Through the glass doors, they could see a woman arranging art supplies for what appeared to be a children's class. Her movements were deliberate, careful, so familiar, yet changed by time. That's her, Margaret breathed, clutching her brother's arm for support. The journalist had arranged the meeting through the center's director, requesting a private room where Elise could meet with potential donors. When she entered the small conference room, Claire Donnelly, now Elise Carson, froze in the doorway, her eyes widening in recognition. For several heartbeats, no one moved. The room seemed to compress around them, 20 years of absence collapsing into a single moment. Robert noticed how his niece's fingers gripped the doorframe, knuckles white with tension. Claire, Margaret finally said, her voice barely audible. Tears welled in Claire's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She made no move to wipe them away. How did you find me? She asked, her voice hoarse with emotion. The game show, Robert explained gently. I saw you in the audience. A flash of understanding crossed her face, followed by something that looked like resignation. Her shoulders slumped slightly, as if a weight she'd been carrying had shifted but not lifted. I never thought, she began, then stopped. Taking a deep breath, she stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her. Yes, she admitted, her voice trembling. I was Claire Donnelly. Margaret moved forward instinctively, arms outstretched, but Claire took a small step back. The rejection was gentle, but clear. 20 years of separation couldn't be bridged in an instant. I need you to understand, Claire said, looking between her mother and uncle with eyes that carried the weight of secrets long kept. I'm not the same person who left Pennsylvania. Robert nodded slowly, recognizing that this reunion was just the beginning of a much longer, more complicated journey. The Claire they had lost was found, but the woman standing before them was, in many ways, still a stranger. After weeks of searching, a breakthrough came when Robert McAllister and Margaret Donnelly discovered Claire working at a local community center in Los Angeles under the name Elise Carson. The revelation left them breathless. 20 years of uncertainty, of grief suspended in amber, had led to this moment. They arranged a quiet confrontation away from prying eyes. When Claire walked into the small coffee shop, time seemed to collapse. She was older now, her face carrying the weight of 2 decades, but unmistakably the same person who had vanished from their lives. Robert noticed her hands trembling as she spotted them waiting. Claire froze mid-step. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by something more complex, Fear mingled with resignation. Tears welled in her eyes as she approached their table. "I always knew this day might come," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient chatter of the cafe. "I was Claire Donnelly once." Margaret reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of touching her daughter's hand. "Why?" was all she could manage. In the privacy of that corner booth, Claire's story unfolded. At 19, she had felt suffocated by the constraints of her small-town life. "I was drowning," she explained, "and then I met him." The older man had promised adventure, freedom, a life beyond the boundaries of rural Pennsylvania. What began as an impulsive escape quickly transformed into something darker. He controlled everything: where I lived, who I spoke to, even what I wore, Claire revealed. Her voice strengthened as she continued. "The first few years I couldn't leave. By the time I could, I'd become someone else entirely." Robert listened intently, noting how his niece's posture shifted between vulnerability and a hard-won resilience. She explained how her new identity had formed like layers of sediment, first as protection, then as genuine reinvention. "Each year made it harder to reach out," she admitted. "What would I even say? Sorry I disappeared for 5 years? 10? 15? Her eyes darted between her mother and uncle. The longer I stayed away, the more impossible returning seemed. The man from the game show, her current partner, knew her history but had honored her choice to remain Elise. "He's not like the first one," Claire insisted. "He understands why I needed to stay hidden." As their conversation stretched into hours, Margaret's tears flowed freely. Robert maintained his composure, though his heart ached with each revelation. Claire, or Elise, as she now thought of herself, had built an entire life separate from them. She had survived, but at the cost of everything and everyone she had once known. When they finally parted, the air between them hung heavy with unresolved questions. Claire had been found, but bringing her home would require navigating 20 years of separate lives, trauma, and choices that couldn't simply be undone. In a quiet corner of the community center, Claire Donnelly sat across from her mother and uncle, her fingers nervously twisting a tissue. The DNA test results lay on the table between them, an irrefutable confirmation of what they already knew in their hearts. After 20 years of uncertainty, science had confirmed what their eyes had recognized. Elise Carson was indeed Claire Donnelly. "I never thought I'd have to prove who I am," she whispered, her voice catching. "But I understand why you needed this." Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling as it covered her daughter's. The years had changed them both, etched lines of worry on faces that once shared the same carefree smile. "The skyline photo," Robert said gently. "That was you?" Claire nodded. "I took it from the apartment where we were living in Chicago. He was out, and I needed you to know I was alive." Her eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't write anything." "He would have found out, but I thought maybe you'd recognize my style, the angle I always used." She explained how she had carefully orchestrated the art show in Portland, submitting work through channels that couldn't be traced back to her. Each piece contained subtle references to her childhood, messages she hoped her family might someday discover. "I was terrified every time," she admitted. "Part of me wanted to be found, but another part—" Her voice trailed off. Robert leaned forward. "Why couldn't you come home, Claire?" The question hung in the air, heavy with 2 decades of pain. "At first I was ashamed," she confessed. "I left with him willingly. I thought we were in love, that he understood me in ways you couldn't." She looked at Margaret apologetically. "Then when I realized what he was, controlling, manipulative, it was too late. He isolated me, monitored everything. By the time I could have left, years had passed." "But later?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. Claire's shoulders slumped. "Later came the fear. Fear of legal consequences for identity fraud. Fear of the pain I'd cause by reappearing. And honestly, fear of trying to be Claire again when I'd been Elise for so long." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone, and time that couldn't be reclaimed. "I built a life," Claire finally said. "It's not perfect, but it's mine. I can't just abandon it and come back to Pennsylvania." Margaret wiped away tears while Robert stared at his hands. The bittersweet reality settled around them. Claire was alive, a miracle they had prayed for, but the daughter they lost would never truly return home. Claire Donnelly agreed to a DNA test which confirmed what Margaret and Robert already knew in their hearts. The results arrived in a sterile envelope, but the clinical language couldn't diminish the emotional weight of those findings. After 20 years of uncertainty, science had validated their hope. The reunion, however, remained fragile. In the quiet corner of a Los Angeles cafe, Claire explained the skyline photograph she had sent years ago. "I wanted you to know I was alive," she admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "The art showed too. I thought maybe someone would recognize my style, but not enough to find me directly." Her voice carried the weight of 2 decades spent constructing walls between her past and present. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly as it covered her daughter's. The physical connection between them seemed both natural and alien, a bridge across 20 years of absence. "I was scared," Claire continued, "of legal consequences, of facing Dad, of the questions I couldn't answer." She paused, looking out the window at the bustling street. "But mostly I was afraid of the pain I'd caused." "How do you apologize for 20 years? Robert sat quietly, observing the resemblance between mother and daughter that time had failed to erase. He noticed how Claire's mannerisms mirrored Margaret's, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the slight tilt of her head when listening. "Your room is exactly the same," Margaret said softly. "I couldn't bear to change it." Claire's eyes welled with tears. "I can't come home," she whispered. "This life, Elise's life, it's real now. I built it piece by piece. The reality settled over them like dust. Claire was alive, but the 19-year-old girl who disappeared would never return. The woman sitting before them carried that girl's memories but had forged a separate existence. As they parted that day, the embrace between mother and daughter lasted longer than necessary, both afraid to let go again. Robert watched, understanding that recovery would be measured not in dramatic reunions but in small moments of reconnection. In the weeks that followed, Claire shared more details about her life as Elise. She described her work at the community center, her small apartment, and the routines she had established. She spoke carefully about her partner, the man from the game show audience, revealing little beyond his supportive presence during her years away. The truth had emerged from shadows, but it offered no simple resolution. Claire was found, yet she remained in many ways just beyond reach, living parallel to the life she might have had, separated by choices that could never be unmade.